Hello, everyone, and welcome to this game review. I just had a viewer ask about how to face the Queen's Gambit declined. So I will go over that more in the future, but today I thought I would just show how Magnus Carlsen faced it in a blitz game, just as an example. And remember, it's always a good way to learn an opening by going over games of the best players to see what they do, how they place the pieces, how they attack and defend, all of that. So this was played in 2023, so it's a new game, newer, played back earlier in the year though. It is a 3-minute game with 2 seconds added to the clock after each move. So the game began with d4, and the opponent first responds with knight to f6. So usually in the Queen's Gambit, they'll respond d4, then d5, and then c4 will be played. But openings can be reached through transposition, where it starts off as one opening and turns into a different opening, through a series of moves. But anyway, so they're starting off, or Magnus is starting off like the Queen's Gambit normally does. So now we've reached the Queen's Gambit declined here. So if we look at this, you have normally d4, d5, c4, then e6, the Queen's Gambit is reached, and the declined Queen's Gambit is when they do not capture this pawn immediately here on c4. So what is going on in this position? Well, both sides are fighting for the center. Their knights have been developed, helping to control the center. There's a battle here for this d5 square. So e6 is defending this pawn, c4 is attacking, and now Magnus Carlsen just bolsters the center here by moving this pawn up 1 to guard the d4 pawn. And it allows this bishop to line up here. And so if the d pawn decides to capture later, the bishop could just recapture and move out towards the center here. So now we have bishop to e7, a common move in the Queen's Gambit, where this bishop, it's trying to figure out where to develop to. If it moved up here, I guess this pawn could move forward and chase it away. But this is a good defensive move. It covers, in some instances, the knight pin here. It could break that pin. Sometimes white will send the bishop up here to g5 and pin the knight to the queen. And so a lot of times the bishop will move here to break that pin. But that's not the case here, as the bishop is blocked in. So now we have b3 being played. So all of these are book moves because the Queen's Gambit has been played for so many years, decades, centuries, I guess. So there's a lot of theory behind the opening. So also, because of that theory, a lot of times, Magnus especially seems to try and veer off into unexpected lines, because he knows that he could run into trouble if he plays against an opponent who just memorized all the best moves, and then a computer helps find a great move in a series of memorized moves. And the game could easily go into a draw or lead to an advantage because of the help from the computer. So Magnus tries to steer the game into unexpected lines, but we're still in book move territory. So b3, not only does it let the bishop develop here to b2 and fire up the center of the board towards the king side, it also backs up the c pawn. So once again, if the d pawn captures, well, now this b pawn could move towards the center and help fight once more for this d5 square. So castling, white develops here, and then we have black doing the same, preparing to fianchetto his bishop. And a lot of times this light squared bishop is a problem for black in the queen's gambit because it can be blocked in by its own pawns, and so black has to decide, where to put this bishop. So knight develops towards the center, a common move in the queen's gambit, where the c pawn is pushed forward first and then the knight moves in behind it to help fight for that d5 square. So now we have bishop to b7. So both sides are just continuing development here. And now c5 is played, gaining space here, attacking the d4 pawn. So black is counterattacking. And what does Magnus do here? He just ignores this and just castles. And now black captures here. So we have this pawn on the side capturing the more valuable central pawn. And so Magnus recaptures. And then we have knight to c6, developing a piece and adding pressure to this d pawn. And the game continues with Magnus once again ignoring the pressure here between the c and d pawn, just developing his queen, connecting the rooks, and rook to c8 being played. A good place for this bishop, although the computer recommends just immediately attacking this light squared bishop here. But generally you want to put your rooks, as I've said before in other videos, on open files or half open files, or behind pawns that you've pushed forward. So white brings his pawn forward here to a good central file, lining up on the queen. So if these pawns were exchanged and they end up moving out of the way, the queen could come under attack. And he also puts the rook behind a pawn that has been pressed forward, and it helps reinforce that pawn. So black does the same, moving his rook to the only square possible behind a pawn that is pushed forward and lining up on the queen. But the computer says this is an inaccuracy, and the game swings back into white's favor slightly. It looks like, once again, knight to b4 attacking the bishop was preferred. So Magnus does the same, develops his rook here to the only space or only square possible, lining up on this half open file. And now we have a bishop retreat, and the computer says this is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to just capture here in the center. So what is this bishop doing? Well, maybe it gets out of the way of the rook, but it could possibly be repositioned here to G7 after moving this pawn forward. So Magnus decides to press forward here with H4, and the computer says this is an inaccuracy. It preferred the knight to just move forward here, which is very interesting. I guess that's a computer move, because pressing this knight forward like this allows a possible capture here, although the knight could move and attack this knight with the bishop. So anyway, Magnus ignores all that, pushes his pawn forward to gain space on the king side, possibly allow this knight to jump up here to G5 and be protected by the pawn. So now capture. Although now this is not the best move. Once again, knight to B4 was preferred by the computer. So Magnus recaptures the pawn. And if we look at the position, it shows black is slightly ahead here. So finally, knight to B4 is played, and now the computer says it's a great move. It attacks the bishop, So Magnus just retreats back and protects this pawn, although the knight was protecting it as well. But continuing on, we have bishop to a6, and the computer says this is a miss and swings the game back in white's favor. So why was this a miss? It looks like bishop capturing on f3 was the better move, which would put black ahead by 0.83, so that's pretty interesting. But why did the bishop move here? Well, to put more pressure on this pawn, line up on the queen. So it says that, if we look at what the computer says black should have done, this bishop captures and then queen captures. Instead of breaking the pawns in front of the king, it prefers the queen capture, allowing the rook to grab this pawn, and then d5. Interesting. Which would give away another pawn, it looks like, but try and break open the center possibly to line up, attack this queen. So I don't know, interesting what the computer comes up with. So back to the game, we have bishop to b1 was played by white, and then black moves his bishop here to a6, lining up on the pawn and the queen, and then knight to e5 is played. So the best move in the position, jumping forward, protecting this pawn, and now the game is in white's favor here. Pretty decent amount, 0.38. So here we have the knight jumping back into the center, and this is possible because of the pin on this pawn by the bishop. So if the pawn captures, then the bishop, of course, would capture the queen. So now, continuing on, knight to b5, jumping forward, blocking this bishop here, and now capture. A great move, keeping the game even. And so the pawn recaptures, of course, to keep material even, and the game continues with bishop to b4 attacking the rook. So the rook must move, and now the queen moves up, protecting this bishop, moving forward. So now the knight jumps up here further into black's position. And so what does black do? He just gains space on the queen side, although the computer says that's an inaccuracy and that bishop to a3 would have been better, maybe trying to exchange the bishops here. So we have g3, giving the king some room to move, possibly protecting this pawn on h4. And so now bishop to c3, which the computer says is a good move, although it prefers the knight retreat to e7, possibly to attack this knight and try and get rid of this knight on c6. So now we have Magnus avoiding the exchange of bishops, trying to keep his bishop pair on the board. So that's always a good strategy. If you have the bishop pair, well, I'll say it's usually a good strategy, because if the position is blocked, the knights, are usually better in a blocked position. But if there's a chance for that position to open up, then it's usually better to have the bishop pair. So if your opponent has the bishop pair, it's generally a good idea to try and exchange that bishop pair off and get rid of one of the bishops. So moving on, the knight moves down into the position, and then we have an attack with bishop to f4, attacking the queen here. So the queen moves, and here the computer says this is a mistake. Generally, it's good to move your queen forward, but there's still a lot of pieces on the board, and the queen could possibly come under attack out here in the center, and the computer prefers queen to f8, retreating back here to a safer square, maybe pushing this g-pawn forward at some point, and trying to fianchetto the queen or move it, reposition it. Anyway, retreating the queen to safety. But here we have bishop to e5 and a miss by Carlsen. The computer prefers the knight jumping back into this position. So let's take a look at that. If the knight were to jump back there, if we had this knight move, knight to e5, it shows that gives white an advantage. And what does it say would happen after that? Knight to e5, and then queen to e8. Interesting. Well, here the knight is in a better centralized position. So perhaps that is what gives the advantage. Although this is still a pretty complicated, tricky position. Okay, moving on before the video gets too long here, which it's already getting there. Let's take a look at what happened in the game. So we had queen to d5, and then the bishop moved up here, threatening to capture this knight. Then we have an exchange here of knights. Pawn captures and the queen captures. So if we look at the material now, black is ahead by 1 pawn. But we have a capture here, breaking apart the king side slightly, leaving this isolated pawn on the H file. And white just pushes forward here, giving up another pawn. And now the queen is under attack. The queen moves over here with check to the king. But now, if we look at black's pawns, he has 2 isolated pawns, and then these doubled pawns here. So his pawn structure is pretty bad, where Carlsen only has 2 pawn islands, this group of 3 pawns here protecting his king, and this isolated pawn here. But now black has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands. So a lot of targets created here by Carlsen. He can attack, try and put pressure on this pawn, the pawns around the king. So moving on, the king must move out of check. So he moves towards the center of the board, and the computer says that is a great move. And then he gives up this pawn. So he gives back some material. And a lot of times that can be to your advantage. If you're ahead in material, you can give some back to keep the game even or to keep you out of trouble. So now we have rook to e5. And so the computer says that this is a mistake, and instead it preferred the move of this rook from the c file to back up this d pawn here. And then h5 by white, pushing this pawn, trying to promote. So if we go back to what happened in the game, after bishop captures, the rook moves down to the center here, probably trying to help protect this pawn. And now we have bishop to f5, limiting the scope of this rook. Now the pawn is free to start marching up the board. And now also the bishop is attacking here, the rook on c8. So the rook moves, bolstering this pawn in the center. And then we have the h pawn, making a run for it. Black counters with the d pawn. And so it's a race for the pawns to just press forward. But black's pawn is stuck now, because the bishop is covering along with this rook. So what does black do? He's going to have a hard time trying to get this pawn moving. Meanwhile, white pushes up further and is 1 move away here from promoting this pawn on the h file. So black must move the king to e7 here. allowing the rook to cover h8 and prevent the promotion. But now bishop to c2 here, repositioning this bishop. And now, this bishop could move over here to b3 and attack the queen, although the bishop is doing a good job of preventing, along with the rook, this pawn from moving forward. And the computer says this is an inaccuracy. It preferred bishop to d3 to just blockade this pawn on d4. So now we have rook to h8, blockading the pawn on h7, and now queen to g7, threatening to capture the rook. So a blunder is played here by black. Now, if we look at the clock, Magnus has 20 seconds left on the clock, 15 for his opponent. And so, in such limited time, blunders can be expected. But rook to h5 is a blunder. It looks like, does it help protect this pawn? But it looks like the queen can just capture the rook here. But there's a threat here also of the queen checkmating white down here on h1. So, of course, Magnus sees this possible checkmate threat, and he moves out here, rook to e1 with check here. So now the rook is back on a better square, but it allows the bishop to capture, and then after a recapture, the king is in check once again. So the king must move away here, and this allows the bishop to jump up here, blocking this mating threat, attacking the queen. So here we have a counterattack, getting rid of this pawn, attacking the queen. And so what does Magnus do? He just gives up his queen with a capture here. And he does this because he's also attacking black's queen. So if black recaptures, then the bishop can just capture the queen, which is what happens in the game. Capture, bishop captures, and now Magnus is ahead a bishop for 2 extra pawns that black has. So basically the equivalent of 1 pawn ahead. So king attacks the bishop steps back, and then the king chases the bishop even further. But now the bishop is blockading this passed pawn, and we have the rook moving up here. But now rook to b1, kind of blocking the king off from being able to run down here and maybe go after this pawn and help escort his pawns forward. So now this b pawn cannot move, and rook to h8 is played, and now an attack on the king here. So the king steps back, and here after rook to f5, the game ended. So if we look at this position, the computer says that white is plus 4.7 ahead here, and the opponent resigns with 3 seconds left. So, how might the game have continued? The computer says that possibly rook to c8, king moves out towards the center, black repositions, maybe to come over here and try and protect his pawns, but the rook goes after this central pawn here to get rid of this passed pawn, and now the bishop is under attack. But the king just steps up to protect, and the rook can go after this isolated pawn. But after capture with check, now, what does black do? So here, the bishop can jump up here and guard this pawn. Black could push forward here, but then the pawn could capture. Rook could capture. Still, that extra bishop is the determining factor, and there was such a limited amount of time the opponent resigned. All right, well, if we go back and just take a quick look, for those of you, wondering how to play against the Queen's Gambit declined, which began basically at this point. So anytime you have d4, d5, c4, and e6, the Queen's Gambit declined because black declines to capture the c pawn. Well, here there are many different paths, and I would recommend, if you're unsure what to play, just check out a few different games by the great players like Magnus and other top champions, and it'll give you ideas on how to play. So if we look to see what Magnus did, these are all book moves. A lot of times black will just develop the knight, develop the bishop here, get ready to castle quickly. Here, white takes a different tact by kind of pushing up here to b3 to reinforce this c4 pawn, which now, if there's a capture, then the b pawn will be pulled towards the center where it can influence the center more. And castle, bishop is lined up here, so this is interesting, placing the bishop along this diagonal where it aims up towards the king side. And now, a common problem, black has to figure out what to do with his bishop. That's a bad bishop blocked in by pawns on the same color square as the bishop. So the knight develops up here. Another common move, when you push the c pawn and then jump the knight in behind it. The knight now fights for d5 and also helps control e4. And so the bishop is developed. Likewise for white. Now there's a fight here. A big fight develops around the central pawns here on d4 and d5. So, it's ignored by Magnus, who instead aims to get all his pieces developed before he starts fighting. So now here, black, attacks early, forcing Magnus to stop, pause his development and recapture. So just remember that. You want to get developed as fast as you can, no matter what opening you're using, but you have to also look at what your opponent's doing and make decisions based on that, especially if they capture some material and you may have to capture back to keep the game even. So development continues, and now the rooks are placed on central squares, and now the fight begins, and Magnus decides to push up towards the king side with this h pawn. Anyway, I'll do a future video and go more into the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit declined. But I hope you enjoyed this video and it helped some to give you ideas of how to play against the Queen's Gambit declined. And so if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions as always. And also any requests for videos that you would like to see in the future. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.